Hi guys, this is the second part of Unit 3 on Islam and Al-Andalus. This is all about Al-Andalus. We'll do politics, economy, and society first. So we have the conquest, and this will take us through the end of the unit. Okay, so first thing is political development, and the most important event, of course, is the conquest, which happened in 711, led by Tariq. We know this already from when we studied the Visigoths. You'll remember the whole polemic with Witiza and Rodrigo and the poisoning, and then Witiza's supporters go to try to overthrow Rodrigo with the help of the Muslims. They bring them in. So you have Lieutenant Musa, the governor of North Africa, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar with Arab and Berber troops. The Berbers, of course, are the tribe from North Africa. And they topple the Visigoth kingdom, they defeat Rodrigo's empire, and end up staying for 700 years, right? We've already seen this in the context of the Visigoths, so you should already know it very, very well. Keep this in mind for the test. Okay. They continued conquering, defeating most of the peninsula in only 4 years. They didn't actually have to defeat most of the peninsula because people were so terrified by them. You remember the Visigoth Empire was not terribly strong, not terribly organized. We're still in the Dark Ages. So when these Muslims with their scary sort of curved swords and their big beards came, people basically surrendered to them immediately. Important battle, the Battle of Covadonga in 722, was the first one that they lost. So this is led by Don Pelayo and his men, leaving only a few small territories in the north as Christians. So those areas were never conquered, and Al-Andalus did not extend all the way up to the Bay of Biscay, right? They did keep going past the Pyrenees until they were defeated by the Franks at the Battle of Poitiers. This we also already know. You remember Charles the Hammer Martel and his defeat of Abderrahman III? Well, that's it again, okay? So really nothing new except they conquered the peninsula in 4 years, and the Battle of Covadonga, which is the first battle they lose. So in a way, you could say that's the beginning of the Reconquest, right? All right. Then you have the independent emirates. You'll remember that an emirate is very often a kingdom within a caliphate. An emirate is a political entity. It's a territory that has a political ruler, but that ruler is not a religious ruler. Okay, so it means that the religious authority belongs to someone else, somewhere else. Okay, so in this case, they're establishing basically like a kingdom, but they maintain their religious ties to the Islamic Empire. So this happens in 756 when Abderrahman I, also called Abdullah Rahman, right, depending on how we translate his name, he came to the peninsula. And he was a fugitive prince from the Umayyads as the transition was happening from the Umayyad Caliphate to the Abbasid Caliphate, right? The Abbasids were conquering the Umayyads and taking their power, and this guy fled. He ran away. Right, he managed to cross all of North Africa by himself and arrived in Al-Andalus, and he declared himself an independent emir. Al-Andalus became an emirate, which is a province that depended on the Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus. The capital of this emirate was Cordoba. And although the emirate was independent, it recognized the religious authority of the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad. So interestingly, his enemies, he still recognized them as having the religious authority. Okay? Questions? Okay. The emirate had to defend itself against many enemies. They have the Christians who conquered Zamora. This is the north. We've already heard about Don Pelayo. You've also got the Franks in the north. You remember about Charles the Hammer Martel. And then you've got something called the Muladi Rebellion. And these are Iberian Muslims, so people who were Christian, who are Spanish and Portuguese, right? Who had converted to Islam, hoping to raise their social status, and then finally they saw that they were still treated as pretty low on the social scale, so they rebelled. So this is a big problem that the emirate is always having. These three groups, this tension between these three groups of Arabs at the top, then the Berbers, who you remember come from north of Africa, right below them, and then the last ones, interestingly, are the Iberian, the Spanish and Portuguese Muslims, okay, the Muladi. And here's a graphic just showing the Reconquest. Extremely simple, right? From north to south, basically. No tricks. All right. The height of the empire is the Caliphate of Cordoba. So we're talking about a little less than 200 years later. in 929, Abderrahman III declared himself caliph, making Al-Andalus independent from Baghdad. So now, instead of being an emirate that's part of the caliphate of the Abbasids, he's saying, no, Al-Andalus is its own caliphate. Even though it's small, he said, we're completely independent. So he's pretty strong. He squashes internal rebellions. He stops them. He fights the Christians in the north and gets them to pay tributes to the Muslims. You remember that tributes are money that you pay to an occupying power, basically to protect you and to not kill you. Okay, Al-Andalus flourished and Cordoba became the most prosperous capital in the west. It was de facto ruled by Almanzor, who continually invaded the Christian areas. If something is de facto ruled by someone, it means that, yes, Abderrahman III is the person in charge officially, but the person who's really making all the decisions is Almanzor. Just like we saw with the mayor of the palace and the Franks, right? Where we saw Charles the Hammer Martel was the mayor of the palace and he was the de facto ruler, the person who actually took all the decisions. The same thing here. You've got a real figurehead, Abderrahman, and then you've got the guy really running the show, and that's Almanzor. And this guy was fierce. He was extremely successful in battle. He continually invaded the Christian areas, so very aggressive. In 57 battles, he had 57 victories, so he never lost. He's undefeated. And he helped many Berber mercenaries, Christian rulers allied against him. This is interesting because a lot of Christians actually had allied with the Muslims against other Christians because their kingdoms were all divided in different sort of, based on the feudal system, which we'll study later, but you had, the kingdom of Leon, the kingdom of Navarra, and they weren't very united. So sometimes they would ally with different Muslim groups, but in this case, they're all against Almanzor because he's so scary. He dies, and the caliphate goes into crisis. Then his son's half-brother, so this guy doesn't have much of a claim to power, tries to take power away from the caliph, and this causes a civil war. And this is terrible, because in 1031, the governors of the provinces declare their independence. Each single province declares its independence. And the whole wonderful caliphate of Cordoba, this united great kingdom, disintegrates into 28 separate taifas, or separate kingdoms, all right? So what is a taifa? A taifa is an Islamic independent kingdom from the Middle Ages, occupying the Iberian Peninsula. So they're super weak. Look how small they are. You can see in this map the examples. A lot of the names that we maintain today are from that time period, right? And we often use even the phrase reinos de taifas when we want to talk about a lot of people not cooperating. That should be, that they're all on the same team, but they're not cooperating, right? All right, the taifas. So the first taifa period is 1031 to 1085. So they're small Muslim kingdoms or emirates. They competed with each other for territory and cultural prestige, which is interesting because they were making each other weaker by fighting all the time. But it was a time of real architectural splendor because they were competing to be the most beautiful, the most sort of splendid and most well-known areas. So you have some really lovely architecture from this period. And of course, the Christians exploit their lack of unity. They use it against them, and they get a lot of headway in the reconquest during this time. All right, here comes trouble. The North African dynasties. So you have the Almoravids and the Almohads. The first ones are the Almoravids. And this is basically the Moors, the Muslims occupying Spain and Portugal in the Middle Ages, ask for help from these Muslim kingdoms of North Africa after the Christian conquest of Toledo. The North Africans were much more fundamentalist and much less tolerant of other religions than the Spanish Moors, right? The Spanish Moors lived side by side with Christians. They would drink wine. A lot of the women didn't wear a veil, right? They were sort of very cosmopolitan and not really terribly observant in their Islam. These guys come along, and it's a different story. These guys are like the ISIS and the Taliban of the Middle Ages. So you can imagine. First are the Almoravids, that's 1085 to 1144, and they were nomadic Berbers. So remember, the Berbers live up in this territory, and they're nomadic, so it means that they don't have an established kingdom. They're all, this is all their territory, but they move around all the time, right? They're not sedentary. They established a large empire, and its capital was Marrakesh. In 1086, they came to the peninsula to help the Taifa kings, so they're trying to fight against the Christians. defeat them in the Battle of Sacrajas, control Al-Andalus again. It's a disaster.